we'll launch into it, and I'm sure as people pour into the conversation, they can introduce themselves on the chat, who you are, what organization you work for, where you're based, so just that we get a sense of who is in the conversation with us. Thank you so much for being here. So this is just a Q&A about the upcoming 12th Global Day of Action of the Support Unpunished campaign. The idea is I will speak very quickly about what the campaign is, and many of you, of course, will be very well acquainted with it. I'm going to give some brief advice about the applications, the application process, and then I can respond to any questions that you may have. So in my view, it is likely that this will be just a half an hour catch up, but if we need further, a little bit more time, then that's okay too. So the Support Unpunished campaign. The Support Unpunished campaign was conceived in 2011. It was the result of both networks of people who use drugs and international organizations getting together to discuss one huge, actually catastrophic situation in relation to people who inject drugs, which is that people who inject drugs are, at the time, were 21 times more likely to acquire HIV. So if you see that little emoji or image illustration of a person holding those big circles, the inner white circle, dotted white circle, that represents the likelihood for the general population. In red, full in red, was the sort of signifies the disproportion that we were seeing at the time. Currently, that disproportion has become worse. So it's 28 times more likely, as you see in the external dotted line. And so that group of people in 2011 got together to think, what can we do in order to tackle the situation, address the situation? Because very often when, especially sort of governments and the powers that be, endeavor to tackle this situation, they very often focus on, they talk about high-risk populations or high-risk behaviors, and it's almost like those behaviors get essentialized in the communities that suffer them. And very little is said about the root causes of that disproportion. So this is a very common tactic of systems of oppression, where like people's own experiences and harms related to their oppression will be blamed on individuals themselves and not the context and circumstances that they experience. And so we had to look at what were those circumstances that people were experiencing. And when we look at those, we realize that to a huge extent, this disproportion owes itself to a dramatic lack of access to health and welfare services for people who inject and use drugs more generally, as well as norms and policies that criminalize and encourage the stigmatization and dehumanization of people who use drugs. So we set out precisely to tackle these two sort of needs, a need for more access to and scale up of harm reduction, as well as the end of all norms, policies, and practices that criminalize, stigmatize, and dehumanize people who use drugs. We thought the best way to go about this was through community mobilization, a community that is centered around the grassroots of our movement, even if it welcomes, of course, with open arms allies. And we set out to raise awareness because a lot of people in our communities still do not know about this disproportion and the struggle that people experience in their lives. We also set out to change the narratives and laws that, as I said, are at the heart of these this violence and this harm against people who use drugs, and of course to promote participation and accountability so that the needs of people who use drugs, that the decisions that are made about the lives of people who use drugs respond to the needs of people who use drugs. Now, the campaign has grown significantly, and through that growth, it has been really interesting and powerful to see different groups come into the conversation and bring with them also a wealth of knowledge about how the war on drugs affects their communities too. So We can talk about, for example, the epidemic of incarceration in relation to drug offenses. Drug offenses account for 1/5 of the people who are deprived of their liberty around the world. So it's a huge driver of incarceration. And in many parts of the world, that incarceration occurs in a context of overcrowding. So people live not only people are caged, but caged in incredibly dire circumstances. It is also an epidemic or a situation of mass scale untreated pain, because a lot of people who need controlled substances in order to manage pain and address their pain cannot access to it, because very often these are controlled medicines. It's also a war on drugs that has encouraged violence against growers, and it's been amazing to see comrades in Myanmar and in Colombia and in different parts of the world highlight how the war on drugs is also war on growers, and how we can find sort of points of convergence in building our movement in solidarity with people who grow crops deemed illicit. And it's of course also a crisis or a challenge related to policing, the policing in particular of poor and otherwise oppressed and marginalized people, racialized people, people of diverse genders, women, and I could list basically a long list of people who basically experience all sorts of oppression and so are doubly, triply, multiply affected by the war on drugs. The campaign does this sort of mobilization by focusing on the power of local partners to define, to identify what their needs are and their needs of their communities, and then to tackle those in ways that make sense in their context. So from London, we're not dictating how people should be organizing sort of in order to address these challenges. We provide an umbrella. When I say from London, I mean from IDPC, because that's where I'm based. I'm sorry, earlier I didn't introduce myself, even though I put it in the slide, Juan Fernandez Ochoa from the International Drug Policy Consortium. So the idea is that local partners are best placed to identify the needs of their communities and also ways to tackle them in ways that make sense in their context, because it is you, our local partners, who know best what the conditions you work with are in where you are, like either your city or your country, your region, etc. It is decentralized in that way, and we rely and we're very grateful to many other sort of what we call with warmth the sister hubs of the campaign, organizations that also help us sort of extend our remit and extend our reach, and to whom we're incredibly grateful. But as you can see, we are invested in this idea of networked change rather than sort of centralized change. In terms of how the campaign functions and the means of engagement or the mechanisms of engagement and advancement of the campaign, as I was saying, decentralized. And so I would say to a certain extent, the first sort of the most essential, we rely on people's own circles and networks to share this. So I always tell local partners and everyone who's interested in campaigning, the campaign starts with you. When you are with your family, when you are with your friends, when you are in your community, talk about these issues, because a lot of people do not really know about them. I'm seeing some people are still coming in. Thank you so much for being here today. But yeah, a reminder to not let these processes of dehumanization and stigmatization that first and foremost are anchored in narratives and the way we talk and the way we talk, because that reflects the way we treat people who are in our society. So there's something very powerful about countering stigma and marginalization where we are in our communities. The other one's the photo project, which is an open photo petition that has been going on from the beginning of the campaign. It has now more than 11,000 entries, which is really exciting. And it basically is a matter of printing the logo, taking the photo, sending it to us. We store it on our website. It's also available on our Facebook. Sometimes we share it also on our other social media, like Instagram, like Twitter. And the idea is both to signal that we're a strong transnational movement with thousands of people behind it. And at the same time to remind each other of that power, of the fact that we're not alone. And actually the campaign, as you will see in a second, has taken place in more than 100 countries worldwide. And then we have the Global Day of Action. I'm going to talk about it in a second, as well as the Initiatives Program. They're both funding facilities to resource grassroots mobilization and mobilization by allies. So I'm going to go straight into the Global Day of Action. The idea of the Global Day of Action from the beginning has been about reclaiming the 26th of June. So the 26th of June is, in the parlance of the United Nations, the International Day Against Illicit Drug Abuse and Drug Trafficking. As you might imagine from the name of this day, it's originally, it was devised in the 1980s. So it was devised when the war on drugs sort of was reaching its highest point, when so many governments of the world started to criminalize people when sometimes they didn't before, in relation to drug possession, for example. So it's a day that has been historically used by governments to brutalize, penalize, and precisely sort of repeat these incredibly damaging narratives about people who use drugs. So we want to reclaim that day and say, actually, tackling issues that societies experience in relation to drugs is primarily about rights, it's primarily about health, it's primarily about social justice. It shouldn't be about punishment, coercion, imprisonment, and all the sort of really tragic things that we're used to seeing the state does in relation to people who use drugs and everyone else who is profiled to be involved in illicit markets, or indeed involved in illicit markets, sometimes out of survival. So we reclaim this day with this sort of positive message, and we encourage, as I said earlier, local ownership, not only in terms of identifying needs, but also how to advance our purpose. Of course, from IDPC, we're very, very happy to provide advice on suggested courses of action. We cannot provide sort of like minute advice on absolutely everything, but we're very happy to sort of suggest certain things that have worked in some places and in similar contexts and might work in your context. We're very happy always to respond to those questions about like refining strategy, even though we acknowledge that you are best placed to define it. We also provide resources like guides to organize, or easily translatable digital materials. I'm going to talk about that in a second, in order to potentiate what you're doing at the national and local level. We also, of course, I was talking about the financial support. The small grants program provides small grants of about $500 in order to organize for that day, for the 26th of June, or around the 26th of June. We always tell people, you know, if the 26th of June doesn't work because it's another particularly busy day in the calendar of your country, or it turns out that it's a day where it's a bank holiday, or there's many reasons why the 26th of June itself might not work. So if you do it around the 26th of June, but keeping in mind that the 26th of June is this focal point, we're not precious about it not being exactly on the 26th of June. So that's really good for you all to know. And this is sort of a reflection of our achievements. This is the last map reflecting activities on the Global Day of Action last year. More than 290 activities in 96 countries, so 297 activities in 96 countries, which is incredible. It's a record for the campaign. So the campaign is as vibrant as it has ever been, and this owes itself to a huge extent, if not entirely, to local partners who mobilize with us. And historically, we've done something really beautiful. In 12 years, we've managed to organize activities together collectively in 125 countries worldwide. And I'm sharing this map, which comes from an evaluation of the lifetime of the campaign. And I cannot wait to show you what the evaluation reflects, because through the experiences of local partners worldwide, we can see sort of the amazing impact that we're all sort of achieving. So I cannot wait to publish that. It's coming in the next few weeks. And I wanted to highlight just some innovative practices and ideas that we've identified from the campaign. This is by no means exhaustive because we don't have much time, but I wanted to highlight some because they speak to very clever ways of using the Global Day of Action that I would encourage you to reflect upon. So for example, the Free School of Harm Reduction in 2021 came to us with a bit of a um, unorthodox request. They said, look, we've talked with the communities that we organize with and we serve. Many of them are street-based, and the main issue that they experience is that they don't have any sort of stable income. So it's really difficult to survive when you're in the street and you don't have any ways to sort of sustain yourself. Could we organize, as part of the Global Day of Action, a barbering course? Um, and like other funders or other funding facilities may respond differently to this, but in our opinion, this was so great because it was identifying a very specific need of communities of people who use drugs, living in particular vulnerability, doing something that could have a dramatic impact on their lives. And then what I found even more sort of clever, and this is where the strategic part that I wanted to highlight comes into play. They use these experiences not only to talk about the impact of the war on drugs and politicize street-based people who were part of that community so that they understand where their circumstances are coming from and empower themselves to be part of the change, but then use those stories to go to the local government and say, this is what the war on drugs in this city is doing to our people. We need to change things. And for me, that mix of unconventional with more formal forms of advocacy is really, really powerful. And of course, powered and motivated by so many of the stories, real life stories that they identified through that project. There's also this fantastic initiatives by IDU Care and Street Law in the Philippines, as you know, struggling with a country struggling with um, really terrible circumstances in relation to the war on drugs initiated by President Duterte in 2016, and which led to more than 27,000 killings. So they put together, they made space for women who had attended rehab services that were sort of as part of the compulsory sort of rehab services that exist in the Philippines, and women who had experience in engaging with harm reduction services to try to see to try to build common ground and create a sense of community, because these groups of women had experienced in the flesh the harms of the war on drugs. They had found different ways to navigate their own experiences in relation to this violence. But there's a very powerful possibility in coming together, even if we have different sort of views of what works for our own bodies and ourselves, but understanding that the war on drugs harms us all and organizing together for it. So I wanted to highlight that because there's something about community building and mobilization in this particular example that I find incredibly promising. I also wanted to highlight this project by Metzeneras in Catalonia. It's a harm reduction cooperative that welcomes women and non-binary people to do all kinds of things, to access services, to organize themselves politically, to support each other. And what they organized was quite similar to what we saw with the free school. So with the people who were already part of their service, that were already coming to the co-op, they organized a big meal with the local community, who initially was a little bit reticent to that shelter and that space being there, because, and actually what they did was do a video of like interviewing the community that participated of that meal. And I will never forget one of the testimonies, one of the stories of one of the neighbors who said, when we heard that, so sorry, when we heard that there would be a shelter that would welcome people who use drugs in our area, we were worried because we thought, like the narratives of the war on drugs, this is not what she said, but the narratives of the war on drugs, automatically when we think drugs, like we're encouraged to think of evil, negative things. And that's what we thought, she said, the person who was being interviewed. But now in this space, when we're talking to the people who are part of this project, we see that they're just like us. Like they're just people with their affections and needs and hopes. And I think, again, in this spirit of humanizing people who use drugs and showing our neighbors that, we are part of the community is incredibly powerful. Um, and finally, I wanted to highlight the Bar Hostess Empowerment and Support Project. In 2022, they organized a march, but they also did some outreach with street-based sex workers who use drugs. This is a group that focuses on people working in the sex trade, sex workers and other people working in the sex trade. And they identified the particular ways in which the war on drugs and the criminalization of sex work and patriarchy operates on these women to organize intersectionally against all of these forms of oppression. And apart from sort of organizing sort of know your rights training, for example, Bar Hostess, BHESP organized this march to highlight the challenges that these women experiences. So again, organizing sort of at the intersections of our oppression and in a spirit of solidarity, incredibly powerful. So that's for some interesting ideas and organizing practices. I wanted to highlight also that we recently released a whole bunch of digital illustrations that you can use on your social media, but you can also print. They're easily translatable. They're currently available in English, Spanish, and French, but they could be very easily, like we have a Word file that you can translate and we can then lay it out and send you the finalized version in your language. So we can do that for you, that laying out. And what we hope is that more and more languages will be available so that you can use these materials in your own campaigning activities. So have a look at that. It's on the website. If you go to the blog section, you'll find it there, and we'll soon put it also in the resources section, a link in there. Finally, very specifically in relation to the application process. So as you know, the application process deadline is on Friday. So there's still plenty of time because we don't need like an extended application. This is a short questionnaire. We understand that the funds are limited. So what we need is one paragraph of description. One good paragraph of description would suffice. So I'm just going to go through some ideas just to make very transparent our thought process through this application system. So first, in terms of equity considerations, this is just to say that the campaign prioritizes mobilization by people or networks of affected communities, particularly, of course, people who use drugs, but other affected communities are very welcome to apply too, as well as initiatives from the Global South, because historically, the Global South, not only through processes of colonization, but also through economic subjugation, has been less able to access resources. So it is our priority to resource Global South as well as grassroots initiatives. This is a grassroots-centered campaign. So that's our thought process, which doesn't mean that if you're not sort of from a community-led network, we'll say no, not at all. But we have to understand that it is important for our movement to build our grassroots. And for part of being an ally to people who use drugs and people affected by the war on drugs is realizing that we should sort of, as much as possible, make sure that resources go to most affected communities, or that most affected communities are resourced. I also wanted to very quickly talk about the SMART goals, because it's important for us that applications are not for projects that will, we want to be as strategic and targeted and impactful as possible, right? Because we don't have much resources, so we need to do our best with what we have. So I think the SMART grid is a really helpful way of honing and perfecting and refining what we're doing and anticipating some of those impacts. So we want the application to be specific, like who exactly will be involved, what is exactly what you're doing, why are you doing it in this way, where are you doing it? Is it like in a very specific part of the city, or it's a multi-site thing in the same city, or it's in different cities of the country? We want to have specifics about what you're planning. We also encourage them to be somewhat, we understand that this is difficult, but somewhat measurable. So have a think of what would be some metrics of success. Like, are you expecting a certain amount of people, or rather is your indication of success that certain high reach personalities have joined or that certain politicians have heard you? This is important because it can help you also shape your strategy. In terms of the A, it has to be attainable. So you need to be clear about what you're aiming. Very often, and I understand this, and we understand this, but very often we will get applications that say, we want to advance harm reduction in our country, and so we're organizing a march. That is important. Of course, we all want to advance harm reduction and decriminalization in our countries, in our like for our local communities, etc. But concretely, which aspect do you want to focus on? Because harm reduction is huge, and decriminalization, the road to scaling up harm reduction and making it available, the road to achieving decriminalization is a long road, and we need to think, what is our next step in the direction of that? Especially if you're in a country where there's no harm reduction, for example, you have to think, what is the next step that we can take in order to reach that goal? So statements, like applications that are solely tell us this is about achieving harm reduction, this is about achieving decrim, are less likely to make it. It has to be relevant. It needs to respond to a need from the community. So if you're doing something that's completely separated from the experiences of the communities that you're mobilizing with or serving, then that will be, it's much less likely that it will be supported. Think through what is particularly affecting your community. It might be police violence. It might be related to criminalization. It might be that there is a harm reduction service, but that harm reduction service doesn't allow for migrants to access it. It might be that that harm reduction service is only open 1 day a week. So think through what are the things that would change and improve the conditions in your community and that would take you further to your ultimate goal. And finally, consider the scope in terms of time. So yeah, like we want to know when this is happening, and we want to see a reflection from local partners that they have considered when is this happening and why. Like it might be, again, like the timeliness of the project, and in particular, and that ties with my next point, the question of sustainability. So if you tell us we're going to use these funds to provide syringes, needle or injecting equipment, injecting kits, harm reduction injecting kits to our community, who otherwise doesn't have access to them, I would probably ask the question, what's going to happen when that injecting equipment finishes? Like, to which extent is your project relying on something that might leave people in a difficult situation if they no longer have access to whatever you were providing before? Have a think about how to make sure that we're responsible with what we organize and that we don't promise something that we cannot offer afterwards. And there's something else that I wanted to say in relation to this, but it's primarily about this, sort of making sure that we're doing something that will contribute to our ultimate goal, but will not leave people in a difficult situation because we've promised or we started providing something that will not be available afterwards. Consider collaborations, because we have limited resources, and the most effective way to make those resources go a long way is through collaboration. So we always, when we identify that there's different partners working in the same city, we always encourage them to organize together. I know it's really difficult to sometimes organize together, especially if we have sort of different views on what our ultimate goals there are, but I would encourage you to maybe even consider this an opportunity to have those conversations. How do we align our purposes so that we're rowing in the same direction? Mariam Kaba, a US scholar on prison abolition, says everything that is worthwhile doing is done with others. So we, for example, do not fund any individual initiatives. We focus on groups, and those can be grassroots collectives that are not formally instituted. But this idea of doing with others and growing our bubble and growing our movement is incredibly important for our efforts, sustainability and impact. And finally, consider our budget constraints and your budget constraints. So if you promise that you're going to organize a conference that has many days of activities, but we only can offer $500 and you're asking for 2,000, that project unfortunately will not prosper because we don't have any means to our $500 will do nothing to achieve your goal. So unless you tell us that you've found or you're looking for alternative sources of funding, that budget will look unrealistic. So think what is realistic within the budget constraints. So this is what I wanted to say in relation to how can you improve the likelihood of your project succeeding. I'm about to look at the Q&A, but also if you want to put them questions in the chat, you're very welcome to. And yeah, let's make this another incredibly successful Global Day of Action as it has been for the last 11 years. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, the floor is yours. I'm all ears.